Hi, my cheeks are all red because I just went for a walk, and I think the capillaries under my skin get close to the surface when that happens. So don't worry, I'm not ill or anything like that. So today's topic, we are going to talk about disaccharides, of which table sugar is one, and also a little bit about artificial sweeteners. So disaccharides, make this a little bit smaller and maybe a little bit bigger. All right. So disaccharides consist of two monosaccharide units. So here I have two monosaccharide units that are hooked together right here, and this is a special type of linkage called an acetyl linkage, and you won't have to memorize that, but if for some reason you ever take a biochemistry class further in your education, you might come across that. So that linkage again is called a glycosidic linkage, and the way that monosaccharides get hooked together to form disaccharides and polysaccharides, one of the main differences in them, as I have mentioned before, is that there are different types of glycosidic linkages. And while you will not have to remember any of the types, my point of sharing the types is just to re-emphasize that that's one of the things that makes them different. So if a disaccharide becomes hydrolyzed, it can be cleaved into two monosaccharides. Now, I mentioned this briefly in a previous video, but I just want to remind you that glucose can come in two forms: the alpha form, in which this particular carbon, which is always the number one carbon in, it's the carbon adjacent to the oxygen. So on that particular carbon, in an alpha glucose, the hydroxide sits below the plane, and in a beta glucose, the hydroxide sits above the plane. So different disaccharides are made of either alpha or beta units. Sometimes they're both alpha, sometimes they're both beta, sometimes there's one that's an alpha, and sometimes there's one that's a beta. So if you look at this right here, that is the symbol for beta. So this is a beta 1,4 glycosidic linkage, and what that means is the number one carbon is linked to a number 4 carbon, and these two both happen to be actually this one happens to be a beta and this one happens to be an alpha, but it is the beta linkage, or it's the beta portion of this that's involved. So if we were to hydrolyze that, that got way out of, not in the middle of them. My pen got out of control. I'm just turning this into a disaster. I might as well just write all over it now, just to be done with it. I can't make it any worse, right? So anyway, disaccharides can become hydrolyzed into two monosaccharides. So the first one that I want to talk about is maltose. Maltose is not found in the free state, and it is a product that forms when in grain, you have grains that begin to sprout, like in the picture here. It's a byproduct of polysaccharides breaking down during the sprouting of grain. So maltose, when you hydrolyze maltose, it breaks down into two glucose units. So maltose is a disaccharide that's made of a glucose and a glucose. So the hydrolysis in the presence of an acid or maltase, remember this is an enzyme that will break down maltose. Often that enzyme is very similar to the name of whatever it's breaking down. So The type of linkage with maltose is an alpha 1,4 glycosidic linkage, and this is the number 1 carbon. This OH group was originally, this is the OH group on this monosaccharide, which is an alpha variation. And when they come together, they form this. And here's, you see that name again, acetyl structure. Again, not something you'll need to memorize, but the only point of showing you this again is to remind you that depending on the nature of the monosaccharide we're talking about, where this OH is on the number 1 carbon and which carbons are involved with the linkage. So here's the number 1 and the number 4. In the way that linkages are represented, oh boy. I just discovered the other day that I have this pen. It's for this Wacom board. If you turn it over, it turns into an eraser, which is really quite a lot of fun. I was trying to draw something one day, and it was just not drawing, and just all I saw was this square on the screen. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. So oftentimes we see beta linkage kind of like this, where we have like a kind of this linear sort of structure like this. And then when we see alpha linkages, we tend to see them like this in this V sort of shape. So that will come back to us when we start talking about starch and cellulose. Lactose is another disaccharide, and it is known as milk sugar. In the previous video that I've made on monosaccharides, I did mention that galactose is named milk sugar. It's a common name, and it is, but generally when someone's referring to milk sugar, they're actually referring to lactose. So when lactose becomes hydrolyzed, it produces galactose and glucose. It is lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down the lactose. And individuals who are lactose intolerant don't have lactase. They no longer produce that. So with that, the lactose cannot be digested, and you can end up with some abdominal cramping and diarrhea, intestinal upset. The common age for the body to no longer make lactase is after the age of 2, when mammals, typically human mammals, well, there isn't any other, humans are always mammals. Anyway, humans typically stop nursing at the age of 2 historically, through the, on average, through various cultures and through the history of humankind. It's usually around the age of 2 that mothers start to have another baby, and the new baby needs to rely on that milk, and the 2-year-old is going to start eating food now. So you can buy lactose-free milk, and I was really curious to know, how did they make lactose-free milk? So I looked it up, and you can mechanically separate that lactose, or you can have it undergo a treatment, and there are several different variations of it in which it's exposed to some lactase, and the lactase just breaks it down into galactose and glucose, so people can enjoy a glass of milk without getting an upset stomach. With lactose, it is a beta 1,4 glycosidic linkage, and you can see that it's drawn a little bit differently. When you hydrolyze it, it breaks down into the right-handed galactose, the right-handed glucose. In fact, all of these sugars are the right-handed variation when we're talking about sugars in biological systems. So the next one I want to talk about is sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. It has a different type of linkage, and it's made of an alpha glucose unit and a beta fructose unit, and the linkage for the sucrose is a 1-2 linkage. So it's the alpha hydroxyl group that's a part of it, but an alpha 1-2 glycosidic linkage. So here is a different one other than 1-4, which is what we've seen before. So sucrose represents the majority of all sweeteners and can be up to 20 to 30% of the average caloric intake in the United States. So when we hydrolyze sucrose, or if sucrose is being made, it's being combined together between the two monosaccharides coming together to form the sucrose. Again, you see this is an alpha linkage. You see kind of this V shape. But here we have glucose and we have fructose. And we mentioned that sucrose is 50% fructose for anyone who is interested in monitoring their fructose intake for any reason. Because of the high number of calories that sucrose has, and also a lot of intake with sucrose can trigger an insulin response to get your blood sugars kind of high. So people on special diets, either because they're trying to lose weight or they don't want high levels of blood glucose, want to monitor their sugar intake. So artificial sweeteners have become very popular in the last century and even beyond that. So here's the classic packets that you see on the table. You see the pink packets and the yellow packets and the blue packets, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one of them. The blue packets are aspartame, the pink packets are saccharin, and the yellow packets are sucralose, and these are all the original brand names. So our artificial sweeteners are developed with the intent to balance concerns for safety, sweetness, and aftertaste. So some of them tend to be a little bit bitter, so sometimes you can get some blending of different artificial sweeteners and mixes in if you're in the market for purchasing them. So they have extremely high relative sweetness compared to actual sweet sugars like sucrose and glucose and fructose. So if fructose is the sweetest of all of the sugars, so we give that a value of 100, and you can see that lactose has the least amount of sweetness of the sugars, but here is sucralose, saccharin, aspartame. Those are three that we're going to talk about, thousands of times sweeter for the same amount. So extremely sweet, tiny quantities are needed to get that sweet effect. So we're going to talk about NutraSweet first, aspartame, and I'm looking at this image and I think that there's been a mistake. I think it's somehow got completely inverted because this is a nitrogen and hydrogen and they're completely backwards. But either way, you see a benzene ring here, and we have a some amide linkages in there, and carboxylic acid end, which is completely irrelevant because you'll never have to identify this. So aspartame, its brand name was Equal. They're the blue packets, and we see a little baby here because what happens when we eat aspartame is that it hydrolyzes into the amino acid phenylalanine. And there is a condition called phenylketonuria, PKU, in which the body cannot process this amino acid and it can build up in the body. If this condition goes undiagnosed, it can lead to, or left untreated, like if somebody is aware that they have this condition and they don't eat the proper diet, to compensate for it, it can lead to intellectual disability, seizures, problems with behavior, and problems with cognition in general, and also some brain imbalances. So thankfully, this is a blood screening of a newborn baby. PKU is a standard screening for a newborn. So very immediately, if a baby has this condition, they can adjust accordingly so that the baby is not taking in. Obviously, we're not going to give a baby aspartame, right? That it's not, we're not trying to protect the baby from NutraSweet, but phenylalanine or phenylalanine is an amino acid in all meats. So what has to happen is if a baby is diagnosed with this, they have to get a formula supplement that does not have this amino acid in it. So it's a very specialized diet. And then throughout the course of their life, these individuals need to adhere to a low protein diet so that they're not being exposed to the phenylalanine. You know, there is a lot about aspartame that I'm really not getting into here, and there's so much information that you could look up, like heat stability, the types of things I'm going to include when I talk about some of the other artificial sweeteners. It's not all inclusive. I just tried to get some interesting information about each, and if you want to learn more, it's very easy to look up. So the next thing that I want to talk about is saccharin, and these the saccharin was originally sold as Sweet and Low, which are the pink packets. And here is the molecular formula for saccharin. It was used extensively in World War I, especially during sugar shortages. It was an alternative to have sweetness in foods. One of the things that is desirable about it is it can be used in baking relatively easily because of its heat stability, and it's the fact that it doesn't react with other things. I don't know if it bothers you that I'm down there when I'm usually up here. It bothers me a little bit. But my cheeks are starting to get to the normal color. So saccharin, as well as the other artificial sweeteners, contains no food energy and has no nutritive value. The next one that I'm going to talk about, Splenda or sucralose, does have a few calories in it, but not very many. Saccharin is often used in carbonated beverages, and because of its really high sweet index, but slightly bitter taste, it can be blended with other artificial sweeteners to really add that enhanced sweetness, and then the other artificial sweeteners will sometimes mask the bitterness that some people experience when they consume saccharin sweetened things. So sucralose is kind of a new artificial sweetener and a bit of a game changer in a lot of ways. Before I go on, I really just want you to look at the two structures of sucralose and sucrose side by side and notice some similarities and differences. And here, I will look too. Are you looking? Okay, I'm done looking. I'm hoping that you notice that they look incredibly similar to one another. And there really are only three differences. And I hope that you found them. Sucralose has a chlorine here, a chlorine here, and a chlorine here. Sucralose is chlorinated table sugar. They chemically will remove the hydroxyl groups so this one will be removed. I think this one will be removed. And this one is removed, so they cleave those off and they replace them with chlorine. And you see on the ads, well, Splenda is just like sugar because it's made from sugar or something like that. I don't remember what it is, but it literally is sucrose that has been modified, and these 3 OH groups have been replaced with chlorines. Now what this results in is, so our taste buds have a receptor that tastes sweetness. And each taste bud receptor is like this trifecta, so there are like 3 spots at each molecule. Each part of the molecule kind of fits in those 3 spots naturally. So this happens with anything that's sweet. Even though all of the artificial sweeteners have different structures, those taste buds get interacted in a very similar way with all sweeteners, whether they're natural or not. So the portion of the molecule that is contributing to that sweetness is still there. But the fact that now we have chlorine here instead of hydroxide makes this not an energy source for us. This is non-caloric, as opposed to sucrose, which is a high calorie food. So we have all the taste and none of the calories. So Splenda was the original trade name for that. When that patent ran out, people were able to start selling generic, which is sucralose. And some interesting facts: it is pretty stable under a wide pH temperature ranges. It's used in baking. They fluff it up a little bit, so the measure is the same. If you need a cup of sugar, you can use a cup of sucralose. And it literally passes through the system unchanged. There is no chemical change through the way. One of the things with this particular artificial sweetener is, in some people, it can lead to the triggering of increased blood glucose levels upon consuming it. And if you consume large amounts of this can, in the human body, when you get high incidences of blood glucose, it triggers that insulin response, and the insulin says, hey, blood glucose, you just need to go someplace else and be used up, and instead of being in this blood. So then it does. It gets taken up by cells. It gets it gets turned into glycogen and stored in the body, and the insulin kind of sweeps the high levels of glucose out of the blood. It doesn't literally sweep it out of the blood. It just triggers this body response to get those high glucose levels down, and it triggers a response that causes the blood glucose to start being used up faster. So some people have similar effects with insulin to sucralose as they do to regular sugar. So this is the conclusion of my discussion on disaccharides and artificial sweeteners, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.